On May 23, 2007, 49 American men and women left their homes to begin what was to be a 2-year service in the United States Peace Corps. Their destination was Kenya, one of East Africa's most stable and economically vibrant countries. Their assignment as public health volunteers was to integrate into Kenyan communities and determine effective ways of improving the lives of their neighbors. First, they would undergo 10 weeks of intensive language, cultural, and technical training, after which they would be sent to their respective towns and villages. My name is Brad Biggers, and I was one of those volunteers, serving along with my wife Whitney. This is our story. Our training took place in Kitui, a town located 3 hours from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Each volunteer was placed with a Kenyan host family as a way of facilitating learning and cross-cultural exchange. Whitney and I lived with a family in the village of Kiluilu, 2 kilometers from the Peace Corps training hub. Most days started with language training in our village, followed by technical, medical, and cultural lessons at the training center or out in the community. Community projects included digging wells and latrines, helping out at secondary schools, and planting trees.
June 3rd, 2007. Kitui is a relatively small town, but it is still big enough to have a couple of small grocery stores, a handful of restaurants, and countless fruit stalls and churches.
We had been advised by former Peace Corps volunteers that training could be one of the most frustrating parts of a volunteer service, and Whitney and I faced a number of challenges while living in Kitui. Our learning of Kiswahili, Kenya's national language, was impaired by the fact that most residents of Kitui spoke the tribal language, Kikamba, in their homes and communities. Our community projects sometimes went so poorly that we had to view them as cautionary tales. The training process seemed to lack coordination and purpose, while offering a one-size-fits-all approach. Some of the most useful information we received in training came from our fellow trainees. Several of us discovered how to browse the internet from our cell phones. This information soon spread throughout the training class, giving trainees an invaluable yet affordable way of accessing information and communicating with others from practically anywhere in Kenya. Internet-ready cell phones are widely available in Kenya for under $100, and data rates are around 20 cents per megabyte. June 21st, 2007. If you can read this, it means I finally managed to get my cell phone onto the internet. We're still working some bugs out of the system, so stay tuned. Despite the challenges we faced, our 10 weeks of training gave us the basic cultural and language proficiency we needed to get started at our sites. At the end of our 10-week training, Whitney and I left Kitui to begin life at our assigned site, a small, isolated village called Njoro in Coast Province near the border with Tanzania. We were sponsored by the Kitobo dispensary, a small health clinic that served Kitobo sublocation. We lived on the grounds of the dispensary and worked under the supervision of Public Health Officer Jeffrey Babashi.
September 3rd, 2007. 5 minutes down the road from the dispensary, there is a spring and several foot trails that go through the forest that follows the riverbank. Outside our village, the area is much less lush, but no less picturesque. There are hills and mountains in every direction. The landscape is a beautiful reddish-brown, spotted with yellowish grasses, baobab trees, low-lying savanna trees, and a few cacti.
The Kitobo sublocation occupies approximately 30 square miles along the border between Kenya and Tanzania, just south of the district capital, Taveta. Kitobo consists of 9 villages and has a population of more than 5,000. Most of these residents engage in low-intensity farming and herding. While the climate of Kitobo is quite dry, the low-lying areas benefit from springs and a high water table, fed by the Kilimanjaro aquifer. This enables year-round farming in many parts of Kitobo, though 5 of the 9 villages lack adequate access to water. Kitobo's residents come from many different parts of East Africa, resulting in a diverse and colorful community. The major tribes include the Taita of Coast Province, Kamba of Eastern Province, and Pare of Tanzania. Christianity is the predominant religion, though 2 of Kitobo's villages have a majority of Muslims. Swahili, rather than a tribal language, serves as the lingua franca. Kitobo is served by 4 primary schools, the dispensary, and a police post. 2 border patrol bases guard the 15-mile boundary with Tanzania. Guards from a 3rd post patrol the threatened Kitobo forest. Major construction projects in the area include a secondary school, a pumping station at the Njoro Ndogo Spring, and the revitalization of the Kitobo Canal. Whitney and I would be living in the dispensary's staff quarters, which is located near the dispensary, the police post, the canal, a protected well, and one of the primary schools. Kitobo Dispensary serves as the primary source of health care in the Kitobo sublocation. It is staffed by a nurse, a laboratory technician, a public health officer, and a pharmacy technician. It is open from 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday, and sees an average of 44 patients a day. Most services are provided for 10 Kenyan shillings, about 15 cents. Peace Corps suggests that volunteers spend their first 3 to 6 months settling in, integrating into their site's community, and familiarizing themselves with the health status and systems present at site. For Whitney and me, our number 1 priority was to make our new home more livable. Our house was a 1-bedroom, concrete block duplex with a tin roof. Like the other houses in our village, it lacked electricity, running water, and indoor plumbing, but we were fortunate to have concrete floors, an indoor bathing area, and a basin in the kitchen that drained to the outside. When we arrived, the house hadn't been lived in for over a year and was infested with lizards, rats, spiders, scorpions, and bats. Our only furniture was a bed, 2 tables, and a chair. We lacked any kind of stove, and a kerosene lantern was our only source of light. By the end of the 2nd week, we were making significant progress. We bought a gas cooker, wash basins, jerry cans, and started stocking our pantry. We managed to rig a deep cycle battery to charge our cell phones, and by the 3rd week we had found a handyman to position our solar panel. Soon after, we installed a light in the kitchen. November 6th, 2007. We're very happy with our modest solar setup. It provides us with everything we need. As we undertook these improvements to our house, we realized that by elevating our standard of living, we risked alienating our neighbors, some of whom lacked even the most basic of amenities. Our worries were put to rest when we saw that all of our co-workers at the dispensary lived at a similar standard to ours or higher. 3 of the 4 staff members lived not at the village, but in the district capital, where they had running water, televisions, refrigerators, and indoor latrines or toilets. Luxuries Whitney and I could only dream of. In the end, we decided the added convenience was worth the risk of appearing well off. Our progress in improving our house stalled about a month into our stay. We hired the same handyman who had put up our solar panel to put up shelves and fix our broken latrine door. But soon after he delivered the materials, he disappeared. Around that same time, we discovered that even during gentle rains, our house was at risk of flooding. We immediately turned our energy to the outside of the house, digging a system of trenches to carry the water away from our house after it fell from the roof. We positioned sandbags in front of both sets of doors as a stopgap measure. By the time the rainy season came in November, we were ready. November 19th, 2007. Twice tonight I've gone out in a poncho and rubber boots with a shovel and a headlamp to reinforce our trenches and channel the water away from our home. If it weren't for our trenches, Whitney and I would be trudging through an inch or more of water inside the house. As our living situation slowly improved, we began investigating the health status of our community. We already knew that water, sanitation, and HIV/AIDS pose significant challenges throughout Kenya, but how did they affect our community? As mentioned earlier, Kitobo is in an arid region, but parts of the sublocation benefit from the Kilimanjaro aquifer. Residents access this water from private and communal wells and at the Njoro Ndogo Spring. A colonial-era canal is being revitalized for agricultural use, and the Kenyan Ministry of Water and Irrigation is building a pumping station to draw water from the spring for distribution to Kitobo households. While we found a great deal of potential in Kitobo's water resources, there was little doubt that they were being underutilized. In all of Kitobo, there were only 17 improved water sources, 15 protected wells, and 2 rainwater catchments. There were an additional 12 unprotected wells, plus the unprotected Njoro Ndogo Spring and the half-built Kitobo Canal. Several villages lacked any source of water, protected or otherwise, leaving residents to walk up to 10 kilometers per day for water. The water situation contrasted greatly with the state of sanitation. Because of an epidemic of cholera in 1997, the Kenyan Ministry of Health had put a great deal of effort into improving sanitation in Kitobo, with considerable success. As of 2007, 85% of households in Kitobo were equipped with adequate latrines, close to double the latrine coverage rate for Kenya as a whole, and on par with more developed countries like Mexico. When we arrived, the push for increased latrine coverage was still going strong, despite what seemed to be a far greater need for potable water. It is possible that the unmet need for water was assumed to be taken care of because of the incipient Njoro Ndogo pumping scheme. However, this project wasn't due to be completed for 5 years or more. In the meantime, thousands of residents would be left without safe or adequate drinking water for years to come. We were never able to access HIV/AIDS prevalence statistics for Kitobo sublocation or Taveta, but the consensus among Ministry of Health employees was that the local HIV prevalence was below the Kenyan national average. Whether or not these anecdotal reports were accurate, Kitobo is vulnerable because of its status as an important international border crossing area. Though Mr. Babashi wanted us to immediately start giving HIV/AIDS lectures at community gatherings, we decided to take things more slowly, speaking informally with our neighbors to gain a sense of our community's needs in this area. As we continued learning more about Kitobo, we realized that local environmental factors presented unique challenges and opportunities for improving the well-being of Kitobo's residents. Much of northern Kitobo was once covered by a large sisal plantation. Years of intensive agriculture stripped the land of its native undergrowth, making the area susceptible to seasonal flooding and erosion. This bridge spans a 10-foot deep gully that opened up on the campus of the Riata Primary School during heavy rains. Students must cross this dangerous bridge every day to go from one school building to the other. September 27, 2007. The bridge was built from an old truck chassis covered by poles and tree branches. We're told the poles and branches were added after a couple of children fell into the gully. The erosion problem is worsened by the unregulated harvesting of sand from these gullies for the production of concrete. This makes the gullies deeper and allows more sediment to be eroded from the highlands. Today the plantation is only a fraction of its original size, though much of the land is still owned by the Sisal estate. Hundreds of people now squat on the property of the estate, in mud and stick homes or in the abandoned colonial-era buildings. For them, it's an uncertain life. Kitobo's crown jewel is the small but pristine Kitobo Forest. Measuring only around half a square mile, Kitobo Forest is like a rainforest without the rain. Sustained by the aquifer and the Njoro Ndogo Spring, the forest is home to birds, salamanders, snakes, lizards, and at least 5 species of monkey. The tiny forest is being threatened by land encroachment, firewood gathering, and poaching. The forest is protected by a government guard post with 2 full-time guards. Despite being isolated and sparsely populated, Kitobo seemed to have a fairly large number of community groups. However, these groups were quite spread out and their meetings were irregular. The public health officer at the dispensary, Jeffrey Babashi, maintains a list of organizations in the sublocation, but this list was not helpful because Whitney and I didn't know where to go or when to be there. Even with these challenges, we were able to attend a number of community meetings in our first few months living in Kitobo. The public health officer at the dispensary is responsible for facilitating meetings of the village health committee. Each village selects 3 community health workers to attend bi-weekly meetings at the dispensary. The workers then return to their villages to promote good health through education. October 7th, 2007. Within each community, village health committee members are the eyes, ears, hands, and mouth of the Ministry of Health, though attendance is a tremendous barrier to the effectiveness of this group. The Village Health Committee and its members were pivotal in increasing the latrine coverage in Kitobo, but that success was beginning to work against its members. Community health workers reported being viewed as village scolds for harping on the importance of sanitation, especially when other issues such as water, malaria, and diarrhea were viewed by residents as much more important. This and other factors contributed to low community health worker morale, resulting in meeting attendance of around 30%. The Kitobo Community Forest Conservation and Environmental Association leads efforts to preserve the fragile Kitobo forest ecosystem. The group meets weekly, and members are responsible for tending the group's tree nursery 1 additional time per week. A major goal of the conservation group is to establish a campground in the forest, which will attract tourism and spread awareness of this vulnerable ecosystem. December 2nd, 2007. Kikofsea believes that the forest can be preserved while still allowing for gathering of firewood and medicinal plants, but that these things must be done in a way that doesn't threaten the forest's survival. As Whitney and I grew more and more familiar with our new community, we began to develop our plans for interventions. Whitney made arrangements to spend the next school year as a science teacher at Kitobo Primary School and Madarasani Primary School. This worked well for her because the schools provided one of the only settings in Kitobo that allowed her a job with a set schedule. Further, by teaching science, she would be responsible for the health curriculum, which allowed her to meet the goals of her public health assignment. All 4 of Kitobo's primary schools are plagued by chronic staff shortages, so they were grateful to have her help. In addition to teaching, Whitney would facilitate the health clubs at both schools.
October 1st, 2007. The headmaster was beyond excited to have me as a regular teacher. Overall, I'm pretty happy about having something to do that is fairly well defined and on a set schedule.
My course of action was less straightforward. I had uncovered a great deal of information on Kitobo's resources and needs, but finding any opportunities to jump in and help was proving difficult. My first opportunity revealed itself via the Kitobo Forest Conservation Group, Kikofsea. I had been attending their meetings for several weeks and was beginning to get a sense of what they were doing. The group had a motivated membership and a nearly functional campsite. However, they were lacking knowledge of how to attract tourists to their campsite. 10 kilometers away in Taveta town, Whitney and I had befriended Hakon Thon, a Norwegian aid worker who was spending a year in Kenya with his wife and 3 children. Hakon had visited the spring and forest in Kitobo and was thrilled at the idea of camping for several days in the Kitobo forest. I put Mr. Thon in touch with the Kikofsea leadership, and they worked out an arrangement for Hakon's family to stay at the campsite in January or February of 2008. Additionally, I put Kikofsea in touch with Ecotourism Kenya, which I found using my internet-capable cell phone. Ecotourism Kenya was established to promote ecotourism and sustainable tourism practices in Kenya. As a member, Kikofsea would gain access to valuable networking and information resources. Meanwhile, I would continue attending meetings and offering my assistance as needed. The main opportunity to help the Village Health Committee was by determining a strategy for increasing meeting attendance. At the time of our arrival at site, the committee was stuck in a destructive cycle. Because of low attendance, the facilitator of the meeting did not want to conduct any trainings. Because there were never any trainings, most members didn't bother showing up. This cycle was getting in the way of the members enacting meaningful change in their villages. Thus, I began developing a survey to determine what the members felt could be improved in order to increase meeting attendance. Meanwhile, it was becoming more and more clear that clean water was not receiving adequate attention. I began designing a water and sanitation survey based on USAID guidelines that would hopefully support my theory and draw more attention to the issue of access to water. On December 27, 2007, Kenya's citizens went to the polls to choose between incumbent President Mwai Kibaki and his challenger, opposition leader Raila Odinga. Polls leading up to the election predicted the closest contest in Kenya's history. This raised the possibility of political unrest in the event of a long vote count or contested results. Isolated violence during November's primary elections further increased worries. Consequently, Peace Corps asked us to stay at our sites during the election and to keep them appraised of our situation in the days surrounding the elections. The election day came and went without incident. However, the vote was so close that counting had to be extended for 3 days. By the time President Mwai Kibaki was declared victorious, tensions were growing and violence had already broken out in some areas. Just minutes after the results were announced, President Kibaki was sworn in for his second term. Mr. Odinga called the results a fraud, and many of his supporters took to the streets in violent protest. Even our area saw isolated violence. This is all that remains of a bar owned by one of the president's supporters that was burned down the night the president was sworn in. Following the election, Peace Corps implemented the Emergency Action Plan, establishing contact with all volunteers and asking that they make preparations in case it became necessary to evacuate. Whitney and I felt safe at all times, but we knew that the situation was not good in other parts of the country. Our friend, Dita Sayers, who had been visiting friends in Kisumu, had been evacuated to Tanzania along with dozens of other volunteers caught up in the violence. In the event of an evacuation, the Emergency Action Plan called for Whitney and me to be evacuated by going first to Voi and then to Mombasa. We were to leave the country over land through Tanzania. This plan was marred by the fact that Voi, Mombasa, and other towns along the route all had seen violent protests and roadblocks in the week following the election. We decided that we needed a backup plan. If things got bad, the easiest way to safety would be to walk the 4 kilometers from our house to the Tanzanian border and make an illegal border crossing. From there, it was only a few more kilometers to a major highway with buses to Tanzania's capital city. January 2nd, 2008. The turbulence of the past 2 weeks has shown us that there's a limit to what Peace Corps can do to keep us safe. When I go into town tomorrow, I will exchange $30 into Tanzanian shillings, just in case push comes to shove. Please don't worry about us. We're safe here. Over the next 2 weeks, close to half the volunteers serving in Kenya would be evacuated to either Tanzania or Uganda. Meanwhile, Whitney and I went about our normal lives as best we could. Things were hardest for our Kenyan neighbors. The start of the school year was postponed a week. Trucks weren't running to Mombasa or Nairobi. Cash crops like bananas and mangoes were unsold and left to rot. Neighbors' children came to our door hungry. The state-run radio station played propaganda blaming food shortages and unrest on the opposition. Hakon and his family had already evacuated. We could tell things were going to get worse before they got better. On Wednesday, January 16th, 2008, we received a call from Associate Peace Corps Director Ann Haviland. She let us know that all Peace Corps Kenya volunteers, including those evacuated to Tanzania and Uganda, were being given the option of going home or transferring to another country with no questions asked. After hours of careful consideration, Whitney and I contacted Anne to let her know that we would be ending our service. Our time in Peace Corps would soon be over. January 16th, 2008. Tomorrow morning, Whitney and I will begin telling our coworkers, friends, and neighbors about our impending departure. We also plan on spending a lot of time these next few days riding around and taking pictures of the area. Kitobo is a beautiful place, and we want to be able to share as much of it as we can with everyone back home and to preserve our own memories. Through good fortune, I met a man named Kibuka Muchi about a week before Whitney and I made the decision to end our service. Mr. Muchi was in the process of starting up a faith-based NGO to aid development in the rural areas surrounding Taveta. He took quite an interest in the work I was doing, and when he learned that I would be leaving, he asked if I would give him copies of my plans and field notes, which I gratefully provided. I believe I left Mr. Muchi with the tools he needs to pick up where I left off in attempting to empower the people of Kitobo. The Forest Conservation Group was extremely disappointed to learn that I would no longer be able to attend their meetings and provide support to their conservation efforts, but they understood what I had to do. I left them with my copy of the Lonely Planet Guide to East Africa and instructed them on how to contact the guide so that their campground could be included in future editions. The chairman of their group presented me with a formal letter of gratitude for the assistance I had provided their organization. The schools and their students were similarly disappointed to be losing Whitney's services as a teacher. She had taught for only one day before breaking the news that she would soon be leaving.
January 19th, 2008. I really wish we had more time. There are several people who haven't been around these last few days. I'm afraid we might not be able to see all of them before we go. It's hard to leave this place, especially so quickly, but there is nothing we can do but make the best of it.
On Sunday, January 20th, we left our village to begin the trek to Nairobi to close out our files. By Saturday, January 26th, we were back on American soil. Less than a week later, the decision was made to pull the remaining 58 volunteers from Kenya. It was the first time in 44 years that Peace Corps Kenya's volunteers were evacuated and the program suspended. Whitney and I learned a lot over the course of our 8 months in Kenya. If we had it all to do over again, there are some changes that we would probably choose to make. Here are some observations that might prove helpful to others wishing to do as we have done. Before reaching our site, Whitney and I were caught up in the romantic idea of doing our Peace Corps service in an isolated village. We got our wish, but we were surprised at the challenges we faced upon arrival. The everyday tasks of living, pumping water, washing clothes, traveling to and from market, took up a disproportionate amount of our time and energy, eroding our ability to be productive. Also, there was so little infrastructure that nearly every project had to be started from scratch. Whitney and I were finally able to start becoming productive once we found people who were willing to do household chores for us, thus reducing our burden. By the time we had been living in Kitobo for 2 months, we had found someone to wash our clothes, fetch our water, and deliver fresh milk to our door. We also found it helpful to ride bicycle taxis into town on market days. Seek help out, don't wait for help to find you. Whitney and I were one of 2 married couples in our training class of nearly 50 volunteers, and we soon found that the Peace Corps experience is far different for a married couple than it is for a single person. This had advantages and disadvantages. We were less likely than our single peers to be the targets of harassment and unwanted attention. Additionally, it was always helpful to have an extra set of hands or to be able to attend 2 different meetings being held at the same time. Unfortunately, as a couple, we were viewed as less approachable by the members of our community, and so meeting people and networking took extra effort. As a married person, it could be harder to integrate into your new community because you always have another American living with you. Also, Whitney found it difficult to learn Swahili because when we were out in public, I was the one expected to talk. This meant she got less practice. As a result, married couples serving in Peace Corps Kenya seemed to end their service early at a higher rate than other volunteers. Of the 5 other couples serving in Peace Corps around the same time as us, 4 went home early before the country was evacuated. During training, volunteers were instructed to avoid giving gifts under practically any circumstances. Whitney and I, however, found that in some cases, giving gifts was a culturally appropriate and necessary way of showing respect for village elders and earning their cooperation. As one example, John, an elder of Riata Ndogo village, invited me to drink palm wine with him at a local establishment, but insisted that I pay. I reluctantly agreed, only to find that he became far more eager to assist me and Whitney from that point on. I believe that Peace Corps has a good point that we should be careful not to be taken advantage of or to set an expectation that Peace Corps is only there to give handouts, but not giving any gifts can be just as much of a hindrance as giving too many. In our 8 months serving as United States Peace Corps volunteers, Whitney and I learned a great deal about Kenya, Kitobo, and our own cultural identities as Americans. Though our time in Africa was cut short by the political situation, we were able to integrate into a foreign culture and begin to enact lasting change upon its residents. We learned a great deal about the realities of life in developing countries. We feel very fortunate to have had this opportunity. The memories and lessons from our time in Kenya will be with us for a lifetime.